All right, everyone. Well, it's great to have you with us. This is our third conversation or coffees with Toni that we've been doing. Our purpose of having this conversation is really to build awareness around FAST and then the different areas in which we operate. And I'm really, really excited for our conversation today. A dear friend of mine, Toni Shields, from the Wisconsin Philanthropy Network, is here with us. And I am hoping that you engage in this conversation. Feel free to ask us questions in the chat. Again, those questions will be fielded to us during the question and answer session. Please also share who you are and where you're from in the chat section. It gives Toni and myself an opportunity to see who's kind of in the room with us. We're looking forward to a really engaging conversation. And I thank again Toni for agreeing to be with this Toni in this conversation. So Toni, would you please, so let me say first, FAST, Families and Schools Together, is an international organization that supports parents and empowers them to be engaged in the lives of their children by helping them build relationships within schools and families and communities. And so those of you in our audience who know FAST know how powerful it is. And we are lucky to be an organization that does have an international presence. And so we can share in different conversations around education, lots of conversations around parent engagement and empowerment and what that looks like. I also want to remind you, if you don't know, FAST was rated number 11 by the United Nations as one of the most powerful parent engagement and empowerment programs in the world. And so you want to find more information on that, you can find that on our website, familiesandschools.org. So now I'd like to turn it over to Toni Shields and ask himself to please give us an introduction about who he is and the organization he represents.
Thanks so much, Toni, for the opportunity to be here and be here with Coffee with Toni. Although I'm not a coffee drinker, I'm a water drinker. So this is, we're just making adjustments on the fly as we go. So
Perfect.
I want to thank you for the opportunity to visit with your group today. I am a big proponent of networks and organizations like yours that are doing good work across platforms, across places, to improve the lives of people on many different levels. Obviously, in this case, education and family participation in the education pursuit. So I appreciate the opportunity to meet with your stakeholders today. Again, my name is Toni Shields. I'm president and CEO of the Wisconsin Philanthropy Network. I've been with the organization now for coming up on 3 years. Before that, I did corporate philanthropy. I did nonprofit work, and I led a membership organization of neighborhood settlement houses within the Milwaukee, southeastern Wisconsin area. WPN, Wisconsin Philanthropy Network, or WPN, is a philanthropy serving organization. So we actually work with philanthropic organizations throughout the state of Wisconsin and our real goal is to promote effective philanthropy and promote effective work, networking for our members, research around philanthropic issues, and then we convene around a myriad of issues that are of interest and concern to the philanthropic sector. We encourage co-funding opportunities and collaboration within that work to move forward the sector of philanthropy. While I am part of an organization that is Wisconsin-based, I am part of a larger network, which is the United Forum on Philanthropy, which is a national organization of philanthropy serving organizations. So I would imagine that everyone on this call is near and dear and close, even in your own region, in your own state, with a philanthropy serving organization in your area. WPN has a broad membership of 130 members that comprise family foundations, community foundations, corporate, health funders, and higher education. And we are, our 130 members contribute about $600 million annually in granting around primarily in Wisconsin, but we do have some national funders that are working within that scope of work. And to give you some context around that, there's 1,700 different philanthropic foundations or donor advised funds in the state of Wisconsin. Of those 1,700, they give out about 780 million. So our 130 members are some of the largest giving funders, most engaged funders within the state of Wisconsin. Kind of moving into the space of what philanthropy is and what that means within Wisconsin. Philanthropy is rooted in generosity, and it's rooted in problem solving by providing resources to help take effective practice to scale, to help source organizations, help sustain organizations, help move forward communities and neighborhoods is really the crust of what philanthropy is. Inside the scope of education, as I mentioned, we have a number of education funders that are part of our work. We have higher education foundations that are also part of our work, and a big part of the conversation that we're having from an educational perspective is really addressing the pipeline for college readiness and addressing the pipeline that people have for effective benchmarking within the K-12 system leading to college readiness. And so much of our conversations are around looking at broader issues that are happening in our community and thinking about looking at the social determinants of health within a given community. What is a healthy community? Well, a healthy community is a community that is safe. A healthy community is a community that people have access to food, healthy foods. They also have access to great education, and they also have access to jobs. And so most of our funders are in one way, shape, or form contributing to the overall health within a community. And we're moving forward with education as being part of those discussions, how we are sourcing opportunities for to support organizations that are developing opportunities and mechanisms for young people to be better at school, after school help, all those types of activities that are part of that ever-growing work that happens within the scope of keeping our kids and making our kids ready through education.
Thank you, Toni. And, in our area, obviously we engage in education. Most of our programs happen in school settings and helping build relationships between, families and schools, the teaching personnel in the schools, the community in schools, and making sure that, families have resources in the community to go back to help them meet their needs. And, when we talk about education and its landscape, certainly COVID has had a tremendous impact and what that looks like. And, for FAST, we certainly had to pivot our programming and move those things that we normally traditionally would do in person. We had to start to move those things online and find ways for families to engage in those activities at home. And so FAST at Home became kind of our response during that time to really help make sure that families could still be engaged at school with the school personnel, and also still be connected as a family within the home by giving them activities that they could do that were positive and relationship building. And so we made a lot of those shifts. And when we think about education in terms of the way we look at it, it's really trying to put the parent at the forefront and having parents find their voice to advocate for their families, what the needs that they have. And so many times, families have shared with us that, it was hard for them to engage in schools. They don't feel comfortable. Maybe they don't have the right literacy. They don't speak the right language. They just don't feel like sometimes schools are the most welcoming place. But a program like FAST really helps build that trust and that connection, because we go into the schools and we help them build those relationships, and we help parents kind of coach through some of those concerns that they would have to help them build those skills that will be lifelong skills that they'll have. And the earlier we can engage families and helping them build those skills when their children are younger carries them through so that their children can be successful throughout their career while they're in school.
It's really interesting you say that, because even in the scope and the context of kind of education as a place where parents can find their voice, real systemic change that a lot of the philanthropic community is supporting is helping people that are living in communities, people that are most affected by decisions that are made by larger systems, are gaining their leadership and gaining that leadership through their voice. One of the first places I think that all of us as parents feel like our first entryway, our first opportunity to really advocate for something that we're passionate about is when we walk up into a school and advocate for our children. Is when we like look up and say, hey, something isn't, something maybe isn't right, or I don't agree with something that's happening, or maybe you might support the approach that the school is having and trying to help your student get an understanding of that. But really, the tenets of and the initial root of positive activities that are happening in given neighborhoods are really started in the school system. And then what people do is if you talk to any really savvy community organizer or really savvy person that is really engaged in a number of issues within their community, and you ask them straight up, what was your first entryway? What was the first thing that you were really passionate about? They'll tell you that they're more than likely to tell you that they started out advocating for their child in school, learned how to do it, and then figured out other places to go and other opportunities to advocate within that space.
Absolutely. And certainly during COVID, there's challenges with parents being able to advocate for their kids, given technology concerns and access concerns. Not all school districts were able to provide access to families. And so, trying to be nimble and trying to provide the best opportunities you can to keep the families engaged, I think is really important. From your perspective, Toni, how do you feel the philanthropy within Wisconsin reacted to COVID? What do you have to say about their response?
Yeah, so what I would say about that is that there was a very high level of inspiration that came out of the philanthropic sector. So as you look at kind of the cadence of COVID and kind of how it approached our communities across the state, we began to hear about this pandemic, the situation that was taking place in January. And as we moved into the February months, and there began to be conversations around kind of a new normal, a new life that is happening within our space, there began to be bubbling under conversations that were taking place within philanthropy. They were talking about their grantees, their funded partners, the nonprofits that they work with, who they are investing in. And the conversations began to come around to what's going to happen within these sectors if there is a shutdown, or what is going to happen to this nonprofit organization that is providing services in a particular kind of way that is engaged with face-to-face contact. What is going to be that response? And then the transition went from how is this organization going to operate to will this organization be able to operate? Will they be able to sustain their work? Will they be able to sustain their funding? And that's really where philanthropy really came in to really affect real change. Philanthropy, for the most part, when they're supporting an organization, and I know you know, Toni, they support programs. A lot of times philanthropy supports a program of an organization and doesn't necessarily support the operating of that organization. And what philanthropy did almost from the start was retool how they were developing their relationships with their funded partners, and basically said, take away, don't worry about the program that we funded, allocate the dollars that we have given you to support your operating, to support your doors remaining open. And so there was an influx of funds that were developed regionally across the state of Wisconsin, where business, community foundations, individual philanthropists began to provide dollars into specific funds to address basic needs like housing, food insecurity, and workforce development in those spaces to make those contributions. Things like the payroll protection program played a significant role in keeping organizations open and keeping organizations going as they went forward. The upside of that is that a lot of great things and a lot of inspirational things happen within that space, but they happen very immediately. A lot of the results that I just talked about were actually developed and moved forward within the first 3 weeks of the shutdown. So we're still talking about early April when these things are happening. Some of those funds are continuing to get contributions, but a lot of those dollars have already been given to some of those nonprofit organizations as they go forward. And so the big challenge that comes as a result of that is that we're 6 months in, we haven't solved the COVID issue. There's still a lot of uncertainty that is coming about within every sector of life, or every sector within American life. Nonprofits and grantees are not any different than that. So now the bigger conversation is, okay, after that first influx of support that lasted over the course of the last 6 months, what's it going to look like going forward? Who's going to be sustainable? When will philanthropy make a decision around continuing to support and invest in those organizations? So there is still a pretty high level of uncertainty as it relates to philanthropy and what philanthropy's role is going to be going forward. But the good news is that philanthropy is engaging in conversations about what this could potentially look like, what this work looks like. Philanthropy is very interested in going forward and looking at their overall impact within the work. So how I would straightforward answer that is very fluid situation, but very intentional conversations that are also happening from the philanthropic sector about that very fluid situation.
Yeah, and I can say personally as a nonprofit, FAST itself benefited from having the PPP loan, and it really helped stabilize us during a really uncertain time when, as you can imagine, being an international organization, every program in the world shut down. And it was really a weird place to be in as a nonprofit that's always been so relationship based, so focused on connecting people and hugging them and loving them is really what we do. And
right.
So not to be able to do that and then have everything that we do in terms of operations in the world shut down is a scary place to be. What I do think, though, and as challenging as the challenges were to try to sustain and stay open and keep, staff working, I think there are opportunities that came out that we don't always look for. So our ability to be able to transform our program and move some of that to at-home programming still provides some virtual opportunities. Some of the things, the greatest things that came out of it is our community of practice, for example. We created a community of practice with our trainers and our providers to stay connected once a month. Now it's allowed our international partners, I see Fernanda's on the call, international partners from Brazil who can engage with us and have conversations, and we're all going through this together. We are in it together, right?
Yeah, that actually is really good perspective, because even from our perspective also, we went through the same thing. And so, even though we are an organization that is kind of rooted in the state of Wisconsin, still a pretty big state, and we're still pretty spread out in terms of our members and our work. And one of the things that's happened through these virtual conversations is, prior to COVID, if we had a program in Milwaukee, we wouldn't get people from other portions of the state to come to those programs. People just immediately viewed that as, well, that's something that's happening in that region and in that space. And what we've been able to do from a programming perspective is we've been able to blur those lines also through virtual meetings and really move the state closer to each other for sharing and conversations that are happening. And the same thing is happening for us as we're working with our national partners. We're engaging in conversations and building stronger and deeper relationships based on the fact that we're able to exchange in ideas and conversations from our home office, from our living room, wherever we are. And that has been a really positive byproduct of COVID, is that we're learning how to do business different. We're learning how to engage with each other in very different ways. And that has only been a positive within the scope of the work.
Absolutely. So can you, because you have this perspective of Wisconsin and the national perspective, given your connections and your network, can you kind of explain, like, what does Wisconsin look like in terms of philanthropy versus kind of the conversations that are going on maybe at a national level, which I assume are somewhat a little bit different? In some ways, Wisconsin has always been progressive in some areas and sometimes a little bit behind. and then vice versa when we
Yeah.
look at the national conversation. Could you just touch
Yeah.
on that a little?
So national philanthropic conversations are always going to be rooted in basic needs. So how are we looking at the basic needs that anyone or any community might have? So going back to that healthy community concept, basic needs, food insecurity, education, health, workforce development are across the board, are across communities. COVID itself, agreement across platforms. When we look at our approach in Wisconsin to addressing COVID, we're right in line with what we're seeing across communities, across different sectors within other places around the country. Where the breakoff happens and where the fluctuation in support comes in is in some of this diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and now moving into racial equity. If you go from region to region and you look at state to state from a philanthropic perspective, organizations are in very different spaces within the life cycle of their equity and racial justice journeys. I would describe Wisconsin as really, the whole Wisconsin Nights aspect of our work. Just kind of put your head down, do your work, pretend it's not really happening within your community. The philanthropic sector, I know from WPN's perspective, that's how we operated. We didn't really move into really deep conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. A few of our members are very passionate about it, but they were doing their own work. As it moves to the broader sector that's out there, we're now moving more into, as we're recognizing that there are a lot of great best practices that are taking place in other communities around the country as it relates to equity issues. And so we're mirroring some of those approaches and thinking about and figuring out how to develop our own strategy here in Wisconsin to address diversity, equity, and most important, racial equity issues within the philanthropic sector. So I would say our work in that vein is going up as our trajectory, as our education, as our willingness to engage in crucial conversations increases. We'll be able to work more within that space of the work. But I would say nationally, there are a number of organizations that are really out front from a racial equity perspective of the number of funders that are out there. The other piece that we're looking at that is happening within Wisconsin and also as a practice nationally is the power of the functional circle or the functional work group or the roundtable, and the power of the regional roundtable, the power of the regional conversations, bringing in funders from particular sectors. So for example, our corporate funders roundtable, there's a lot of nuance to corporate funding and philanthropy. And so we're bringing in that group together. We bring in education funders, as I had mentioned previously, and then we do regional work around spaces and work that we're doing. We're increasing our footprint on rural spaces, engaging more rural conversations in the space of philanthropy. So there's power within that powerful network of bringing organizations together for conversations. And I think the lastly, what I would say is that the greatest beauty about philanthropy is that most philanthropic organizations are very comfortable in their own skin. So they are willing to collaborate, they're willing to partner, they're willing to share best practices because there's not a lot of competition. When you move nonprofit and grantee organizations together in a room, because of the scarcity issue around funding, there tends to be more competition. So the philanthropic area doesn't have that byproduct of work. We're actually able to roll up our sleeves, sit down at the table, and really think about what collaboration could look like. And that's really a very powerful and inspiring context of the work within philanthropy.
Yeah, anytime that you can bring philanthropists together with, community and working on solutions, you do come up with a really good solution. It's kind of bring those heads together and provide a safe space for everybody to have a part of that conversation to be able to share ideas and try to help them move forward.
Yeah, and the other piece of that is one other thing. The other piece of that is developing philanthropy is really looking hard at developing trust-based practices. So it goes right to your point, Toni, that philanthropy wants to engage in a crucial conversations with our grantees about the challenges that they're facing. The glowing story about all the great work that we're doing and all the success that we're having as nonprofit organizations. Grant funders are becoming more savvy to that, and they are tuning out those uber positive stories for tell us the truth. What's really going on? What are your real challenges? What's happening within your organization? And philanthropy wants to have those conversations and build a platform where those grantees can feel trusted enough to be able to be candid about what their real challenges are.
Absolutely. So we have talked already for 25 minutes. Toni, can you imagine?
Wow, that's fast.
You and I are just on this. So I want to leave room for questions. If you have questions, please submit them into the chat, and Jackie will field those questions to us so that we can get to some of your questions. In the event that we don't get to every question, we will follow up when we always send our thank you for joining us with the link to this conversation. We also can send the answers to the questions so that no question is left unanswered. So never feel like it won't be. They certainly will. So Jackie, do we have a few questions?
We don't have any questions yet, but perhaps while we're waiting for people to come up with their questions, maybe we could talk more about, we know there's a lot of unknowns surrounding philanthropy and the COVID-19, but there's also some things to be hopeful about. And I know both of you guys have already touched on a few of those things. Maybe we could talk more about that, or feel free to continue your conversation.
So I think what people can be hopeful about from a philanthropic perspective is that there were initial concerns around markets and what effect that was going to have on the ability for philanthropic organizations to grant at the levels that they were able to grant at pre-COVID. So many of our philanthropic interests around the state did not take a significant hit, or they're at least able to see some positives in terms of gains within their organizations. And so the whole notion that funding is going to dry up from a number of philanthropic interests is not the case. There's still a very fluid atmosphere relative to granting and what that looks like. Some specific segments are facing some things based on nuance, with pretty much primarily in the corporate sector, because of business interests and things that are happening in those spaces. But for the most part, funding is there to look at. Also, things that are happening are that to be very hopeful about are that funders have acknowledged the impact of COVID, and they have expressed to us that they are not decreasing the amount of giving that they're giving, and in most cases, in a lot of cases, they're going to be increasing their giving as a result of COVID. And then the other hopeful thing is the conversations that are taking place, that there are actually real discussions that are happening among philanthropy, and then there's some additional partnerships that are happening, more relief projects that are out there that are being conceptualized to help nonprofits and education entities grow. And so there just are a lot of really good conversations that are taking place among philanthropic interests within the space.
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed too is that there's much more collaboration going on. So if one philanthropic organization does basic needs, then another philanthropic organization is picking something else to fund to kind of piece it together so that there's funding going out for a number of different things. The one thing that I still have in my mind, and I know you and I have had this conversation, is about post-COVID in terms of impact on children and families and mental health in particular, yes, and in particular PTSD, given the length of time that we are exposed to the virus and the separation and isolation with children and families still being at home, and some people not having jobs or returning to work, and some people still having to do virtual learning, especially for children in school and their home. Is there a willingness, or is there some type of initiatives going on now? Are those conversations happening in philanthropy around post-COVID? What could we expect as opportunities in terms of nonprofits or programs to kind of look towards thinking, already preparing for what we know will happen probably 3 to 5 years from now?
the biggest conversation that we're having, or one connector to what you just brought up, Toni, is almost immediately within the scope of COVID and what has happened. Philanthropy began at least teeing up the conversation about the aftermath. What is going to be the aftermath of COVID? What does that look like? There hasn't been a lot of conversation about 3 to 5 years out. I would describe the timing around that as more of a conversation around 1 to 2 years out and what that looks like. But I can tell you that the whole aspect of mental health across many different platforms, from a COVID perspective, as well as a racial equity perspective, is an ongoing discussion that is out there. How are we feeding our souls? How are we gauging our energy level? How are we coping with environments that we aren't necessarily used to? And how are we coping with situations that we aren't necessarily used to? And then also, one of the most important keys is kind of the smell test for young people. The school environment is a significant benchmark for young people that are in trauma. When they show up to school and they're malnourished, or they show up to school and they may be experiencing some type of mental or physical abuse, the school system is usually the first responder to understand when those things are happening. And because of the environment that we're in right now, that face-to-face interactions aren't taking place. So there's a whole myriad of things that are kind of floating underneath the system that that are going to need to be addressed, that directly are going to affect the overall mental health of our communities and the mental health of our world. The beauty of it is that we're all very resilient within our work and within the work that we're doing. The sad part is that why do we have to be resilient? Because things are happening that aren't happening in good spaces for us.
Yeah, I understand. So we are really over time, but there was a question about how to apply for the PPP program. My best advice for you is to work with your local bank that your organization works with. That was the easiest way for us. It's a federal application. They can walk you through that process. They will tell you what documentation you need to provide, and they will then submit that on your behalf as your lender. And then they will receive those funds into the account that you have at that bank. So if you have any other advice, Toni, that's kind of
the biggest, that's the blueprint for doing it. I think the other big aspect of it is there are a lot of third-party organizations that are helping organizations get PPP loans. I would stay away from those organizations as a cold call. I would work directly with who you have a banking relationship with. Then if they don't have the PPP funds, or they're not able to provide a loan to you, at least they're the ones that can tell you where you need to go as a next step. The other thing to keep in mind is that a number of philanthropic serving organizations around the country are developing mechanisms for developing nonprofit recovery loans. So that's something that hasn't been finalized in most states around the country. Some are working on some of those aspects around that. Some of the states that are doing it right now are Iowa, Colorado has one intact, Delaware has a fund, and then there are a number of organizations that are working collaboratively with various state organizations and entities trying to structure and develop deals like that. We have not finalized one here in Wisconsin as of yet, but we're working to try to develop a mechanism to be able to do that. So stay tuned. I'm not sure if it will happen, but it's something that we're looking at trying to get done.
Well, as a Wisconsin-based nonprofit, I am hopeful that will happen.
Yes.
But, I understand that, those things take time too.
Yes.
We are a few minutes over, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank Toni for joining us today as our special guest and sharing his knowledge and his information. It's always great for me to sit with him. We could sit and talk forever.
Ever.
Right, ever and ever. That's what we do. Always solving the world's problems, one conversation at a time.
One cup of coffee at a time.
But thank you all for joining us. We hope it was a good conversation. We hope you got something out of it. Again, any questions, submit them before you log off, and we can answer those questions for you. We're happy to do that. And thank you for joining us. And this wraps up our time together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Toni. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Toni.
All righty. Be good.
Bye-bye.